All right, guys. Well, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Django, who is the judge of the Forgotten Lands issue. Django is the author of The Shadow Campaigns and Ashes of the Sun, one of my favorite authors, and it's been an absolute honor to have you here and judging the contest with me. We're also joined by Darcy, who is the winner of the Elegant Literature Award for New Writers and $3,000 grand prize for the issue that just came out in November with his story, Solid Flesh. So thank you, Darcy, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So just before we get started, and I hand this over to Django, why don't, Darcy, you take maybe 1 minute or so to tell anybody watching this what your story was about. And anybody watching, you should go read it before we do this. It's really good. But Darcy, give us a little recap just so we're all on the same page.
Sure. So essentially, we have the reluctant immortal, right? The person who does not want to live forever, but against their will, for some reason, is. And they are traveling apparently across the galaxy, seeking gods or powerful deities and things to try to get someone, something to end their existence, because they are simply tired of it. And we enter the scene, and he's confronted with this god that is essentially a pile of bones that can animate. And this god is powerful, and it brings death to those who pray to it.
Yeah, great. And then, of course, the story goes on from there. And to understand the rest of this conversation, anybody watching, go read the story. It's great. It won the award. So, Django, you were the judge for this contest. You selected Darcy's story as the winner. You wrote some wonderful comments about it. And so I want to hand this interview over to you to talk to Darcy about your thoughts, feelings on the story, and get us to know him a little bit more.
Thanks. Hi, Darcy. It's great to meet you in person after reading your story. It's wonderful.
Thank you. I really appreciated your comments.
Yeah, it was a privilege to read all these great stories, but this was my favorite. Before we get into the story itself, can you talk to us a little bit about what your sort of journey to being a writer has been like? You know, what's your life like otherwise?
Sure. So I used to be a professional magician. That was my full-time thing. Yeah, I would perform at a restaurant every Saturday night. I would do private shows during the week, mostly doing close-up magic. Then I developed some health issues. The one in particular that has driven me into retirement from magic, as it were, is arthritis in my hands.
Ooh, that's tough.
Right.
I can imagine that would be very hard. How did you get into magic?
I started as a kid. Presumably my parents bought me some magic kit or something. And then I used to just perform for anyone who would watch. I was very shy as a child, so it was sort of my way of interacting with people. About 12 years old, I sort of stopped, and then I went on, did other things. I won some chess tournaments and stuff, did high school. And then around 17, I met this girl, and I wanted to impress her. So I started to pick up magic again for that explicit purpose. It did not work at all. But I was performing at a family gathering for an uncle, and he offered to pay me to do a show. I was like, oh, okay. So I went and did a show at his work, which is on a Navy base in San Diego. And then I realized, maybe this is something I can do after high school. So I finished last year of high school. And then I started walking into restaurants and asking, hey, are you interested in having someone perform while people are waiting for their food? And like the 10th restaurant, and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Let's do this. Wonderful. Yeah. And then started doing that, and I would pass my business card out there. People would hire me for other shows during the week, et cetera, et cetera. Went to magic conventions, met a bunch of magicians, kept learning. So I basically did that for a couple of years until COVID. And then I sort of the magic thing kind of slacked off there, as many things did. Right. So I became a sous chef, basically. I started working doing that, which is another thing I really enjoy, cooking, making food. And I did magic at the same time, just less of it, until the arthritis hit, and I had to quit both. So now, because, working with your hands in the kitchen is also extremely intense.
That's tough.
Yeah.
And so from then
how did you transition from magic and sous chef? You got arthritis in your hands, so you can't use them. And so you chose writing
right. So one of the things I learned, as I was mentioning, the magic conventions and talking to other magicians, is that a huge part of becoming a good magician, a good performer, is storytelling, is the ability to, because if you just take a coin and make it vanish, it's like, oh, you're just tricking me. But if you tell the story of a coin with a bird on it, and the bird takes flight and it flies from one hand to the other. Suddenly it's magic. It's not just a trick. It's not just a gotcha moment. It's something that transcends human understanding into the realm of that which is magical, which is wonderful, which is fantastical, right? So I started to become interested in storytelling from there. I've always loved reading, and I did not like writing in high school. I hated it. And I think one of the reasons for that was that my curriculum required essentially that I use an outline for everything. But then I learned you don't have to use an outline to become more like what Stephen King is, or George R. Martin, what they call what's the term? I think a garden writer, something like that. Basically, where you start off with an idea and you just sort of write the story without an outline, which is what I do now. And I really enjoy doing that. So yeah, that's how I sort of transitioned from that into writing. And then I saw the contest on Instagram because I was following one of those writing pages. I forget what it's called, but I saw the contest there. I was like, oh, this seems interesting. Why don't I write something for this? And I did.
That's great. Yeah, process is so personal. A lot of people will say, oh, this is the way you have to do writing, and it's never true. Everybody has their own way, and some things work for some people and don't work for other people. It's something I say at conventions a lot because people are like, what's the way to do writing? And I'm like, there's no such thing.
What is the way? There's no. It's all the way.
The problem is there are many people who will happily tell you the way either because they're a high school teacher or because they have a book to sell or whatever.
Because they're a writing coach.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's all just tools.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. And then, so how did you come to this particular story?
Well, I suppose it began with a rabbit. So I live in Southern.
Do you have one of those with?
No.
As
I live
a magician?
No, not that kind of rabbit. No, the kind of rabbit you hunt down and eat. Yeah, I live in Southern California, but in the country, right? I actually live at 4,000 feet, so we do get snow every year. So it's very odd living in a typically hot place. And then I go an hour and I'm in the desert, Palm Springs, and an hour that way. Or 2 hours that way, I'm in LA. So it's very weird to be in this sort of place where I literally cannot see my neighbors. It's all wilderness around me. So one of the things I do enjoy is hunting, but you see a lot of just bones around, right? Animals. And then when I saw the prompt for a bone, and I do live in a very dry climate. Originally, the story I thought of was, what if there were a rabbit's skull that essentially collected dampness and then forgotten lands? What if the character was surrounded by nothing, by ruins, by desert and sand, and this was literally his only means of survival, this supernaturally water producing rabbit's skull? And then I thought about what that would do to a person, and I thought about the implications of perhaps him worshiping the skull. And then from there, it sort of shifted into something else entirely once I started thinking of a religious aspect to it. And I don't remember exactly what I was doing. I was either out for a hike or I was trying to fall asleep at 2 a.m. And I wrote something. It was one of those two. And I wrote the opening statement of the story in my notes app. I stand before the altar of bones and I do not pray. Pray and die, it is said. It is said for a reason. And that I just wrote that down and then continued on with whatever I was doing, trying to go to sleep or hiking, whatever. But that part stayed the same. And I started to write that story. And like I said, I don't do outlines. So everything sort of just developed naturally as I was writing the story.
Notes apps are a real boon to writers because,
yes,
we have an idea, but now we have this thing with us 24/7.
I actually
little machines.
Right.
Remember things.
I prefer
maybe in the shower.
Yeah, I prefer when I can. I do use a fountain pen, and I have a little notebook I literally have with me 24/7. Right. So I do write in this ideas as well when I remember, but sometimes, especially if I was me trying to fall asleep, I just grab my phone and type it out,
Yeah.
Are you a fountain pen geek? I have a bunch of writer friends who are
I don't know if I would call myself
into fountain pens.
I don't know if I call myself a geek per se. I like old things.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I can relate to that. I think, isn't it Neil Gaiman who has like 25 fountain pens or something?
Yeah.
Yes, he talks about that in an interview. I was like, Neil Gaiman is my favorite author, and I discovered, oh, he likes fountain pens too. That's cool.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I can see some Neil Gaiman stuff. His short stories, Neil Gaiman short stories, are wonderful.
Yeah, I would say that in particular on this story, that writing was heavily influenced by Neil Gaiman. In particular, The Sandman, because it's a comic, the writing is extremely condensed, and I kind of borrowed from that. I don't know if you've read The Sandman or seen the show.
Oh yeah, of course.
The fight between Lucifer and Morpheus.
Mm-hmm.
There's this beautiful use of language. Lucifer says, "I am a dire wolf, night stalking, lethal prowler." That bit at the end, night stalking, lethal prowler. These compound kind of words, mixing these together. Yorisuke Le Guin does this too. I found that extremely powerful, and I wanted to use at least a little bit of that in my story.
Speaking of compactness, one of the challenges of this contest is 2,000 words is really short for a short story.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that? Because one of the things, and I talk about this in my comments, that was my favorite about your story is I feel like it did the best job of all the submissions of packing the idea into that space. There were a few submissions that I really liked, but felt like they were the intro to a novel rather than a story that worked in that space.
Well, that might be because I've been learning to write just from this magazine. I hadn't really written much stuff before I started to submit to here, besides what I absolutely had to for school. I've started a couple novels, but they sort of remained unfinished, and then I've just been trying to learn what I can from the internet, as it were, about writing. But my actual practical pen to paper, as it were, has been in the 2,000 word section. Plus, I think the influence from writers like Neil Gaiman, in particular, like the comics, you can only fit a certain number of texts on each page, right? So that you have to try to pack a lot in there, as it were. And then,
have you ever read in one of his short story collections? He has a story called Nicholas Was, which is exactly 100 words long.
I have not read that one yet. I've been going through his short story collections of late.
Read that. I came across that story as an example of just like how amazing and succinctly you can tell this complete crazy story in such a small pace. Like that is the epitome of flash fiction. I think is that Nicholas Was so good. You should definitely read that.
Right. The other thing I did in this story in particular was, I think, in a short story in a fantasy or sci-fi setting, you have to be careful when you're trying to introduce a bunch of terms that don't exist in our world, because you're not going to be able to go reference them 100 pages later. It is what it is. So the advantage of this universe that our world does sort of exist in, but is forgotten, is that you can use very human terms, and you don't have to introduce a bunch of crazy lingo, as it were, and then spend time explaining it. I think that's one of the other things that help keep it short and condensed, is that I didn't, waste time making up words and explaining what they mean, just kept to a very human view of this world.
Yeah, you did a great job sort of weaving the information we get about the world into the story, rather than having to do an expository info dump, which is something you can get away with in a novel, but in a story this size is just kind of death to do, like a big, like, by the way, this is how the world works type of moment.
So I see it a lot. People do that. Even sometimes like a paragraph of exposition is too much in a story like this. Like it'll kill your momentum if you can't find a way to insert it in the story itself and give a bit of context. If you just kind of take away from the story and then you've used up a fifth of your words giving context.
Yeah, 2,000 words. I mean, for those who aren't used to thinking in word count, I mean, that's really small. A typical short story is more like 6,000 or 7,000 words, and a novel is 100,000 words. I mean, average. Obviously, it's pretty varied. So this is a really small space, and so it's impressive to be able to do it.
You had several characters as well, like that came and went, And I felt that because you obviously had Black, who's the main character, the human, and then the bone god, who ended up being a bit of a deeper character than just some kind of callous supernatural god, I think. And then you had two others beyond that, right?
Right. Trum and Zau.
And I felt they were both distinct and interesting, and they both seemed to be driven by different things. And getting four almost like complete characters in 2,000 words is, I think, a pretty good achievement. It's difficult to do and tell a story.
I don't know if I have an explanation for how I did that, except that I needed something to happen to drive the story forward. And an altar is a natural place, like for people to sort of come and visit, and it just made sense that he's waiting there because he wants this being to kill him. And of course, as he's waiting, other supplicants are going to come with different motivations. And that was one of the things I did have to go back in my second draft. My first draft, they were not described well. They were very flat and uninteresting. So I had to go back and sort of, okay, what would these things look like? And my second pass around, it kind of got, okay, I was like, okay, this is good. I'm not spending too much time on this, but they feel like things that exist in this world.
So science fiction and fantasy are often thought of as separate things, although not always. Do you have any thoughts about, I mean, this is a book or a story rather, that has, obviously science fictional stuff. There's planets, there's space travel, there's, we're not in a knights and castles universe, but also there seems to be some kind of magic, or gods or religious stuff.
Right. I liked the idea of combining those. I'm actually pretty new to reading both sci-fi and fantasy, but I really do enjoy Dune. I finished the fourth book, and Dune is this weird thing where it sort of claims to be sci-fi, but it really has a fantasy vibe to it. And arguably in some respects is fantasy, even though Frank Herbert does try to give these sci-fi explanations. It runs more like magic than it really does sci-fi in some senses. And I just like I must not fear is the mind killer. It runs like a spell, even though it's not in the world, and it has that feel to it. So I kind of was influenced by that.
Well, and it has the Bene Gesserit who can literally speak and cause effects to happen, right? If that's not magic.
And he has these scenes where they like to show the training of the muscles and specific control of the throat muscles, which is a really cool explanation, but it still feels like magic to me. Other thing I was influenced by, what fantasy have I? One of the books I am writing is urban fantasy, and my second favorite book is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which is very urban fantasy. So I think that was probably another influence on that.
That's great. Yeah, the borders are a little more permeable than people tend to think, but it's always interesting to see something that straddles that borderline. It reminded me, the stuff in your story actually reminds me a little bit of Gideon the Ninth. Have you read that?
Afraid not.
I recommend it. It's good.
I was feeling that way
books
too.
in that series.
The general vibe
is the author, and it's space opera with necromancy. It has a lot in common.
Okay.
Yeah,
give it a go.
I agree with that, and I really liked how, Darcy, that you did blend science fiction and fantasy. I thought it was really effective because you have your whole story is taking place in this one cave, right? And if it was just a fantasy story, you might get, if you had those other two characters come from other kingdoms or something like that, it would not give the sense of scope that your story did, because you had them, they talked about planets, and he had visited 17 other gods across countless planets and systems and things like that. So even though you didn't go, it was more sort of fantasy feeling in the terms of they were in a cave and there was magic, and that was what it was about, and it was about a god. You using that science fiction setting really just blew up the scope of the story and made it seem like it was one small place in a huge universe, rather than just one small place in a small kingdom on a planet or something like that. So I thought that was really effective in making it feel very big, even while you maintained your focus very small.
Right. And you can kind of see that with the moss, right? The place I do remember seeing that before is Rick Riordan in the Magnus Chase books. They go into the dwarf realm, and their source of light, it's underground, so the source of light is this glowing moss, and it runs on a cycle. But my explanation for it was more sci-fi. It was, I also do gardening, agriculture, and I've studied that a lot. And the breeding, selecting of plants is really interesting to me. It's like, oh, what if they had selected this moss over generations to do this thing that normally has a very magical explanation to it?
Okay. Yeah. So, what are you doing now? Do you have a new project? Is there something you're working on?
I still have these 2 novels I'm trying to finish that are not getting done.
Finishing a novel is a long slog.
Right. And then I suppose I just will try to write for other magazines now that I've written for the one magazine that takes new authors. I'll try to write for others to see if they'll accept me, short stories, try to get my name out there more, as it were. So it's something I've heard George R. Martin talk about, that a beginning writer should try to write short stories for magazines while they're finishing their novel, because you can really improve your writing in a faster way, and because it gets your name out there and people can look forward to your novel more.
And there's a lot to be said for sort of trying to consistently write short stories, because you get a tighter feedback loop on what you could improve on. So if you write something and it, if you're doing a novel, it might take months or years before you show it to anybody and get any meaningful feedback from it. But with a short story, you bang out 2,000 words in a few days, a week or two, and then you can have a couple of people give you feedback. And if you identify a place that you could improve, like if you're using your passive voice too much, the next short story doesn't take too long, and you can concentrate on trying to improve that one specific area until it's much more natural to you, and then continue to improve in smaller, quicker cycles than traditional novels. So
yes, definitely. I've sort of improved rapidly over the last few months. Like, even I can tell that. So I've like, the parts of a novel that I already wrote, like, oh, now I'm going to have to rewrite this because this is bad. I have to, and I can see that now. So I'm going to have to go and rewrite this. So that is one of the things that George R. R. Martin was talking about in relation to that short stories, they have a higher turnover rate. You can, you don't spend nearly as long on them. So if you write a bad one, it's not such a big deal. You can move on to the next one.
Yeah, a good writing group helps a lot with that. If you have a group of people either in person or online that you can share your work with and get feedback, that, because sometimes you're not going to get extensive feedback like from a magazine, like obviously this is a kind of a special case, but
right,
sometimes you'll just get a form rejection.
Even I know this is a very particular case in a positive way.
It's good to have some people who you can rely on to give you a good thing. Yeah, it's funny, it's sort of changing back in when I kind of got started writing, which is about 20 years ago now, the short story markets were just really dead. There was almost nothing left. From when George R. R. Martin got started back in the 60s, there were a ton of short story markets. I remember a statistic that there were something like 150 professional paying markets in like 1960, and by 2000 there were about 8. And so that had collapsed. But then with the rise of ebooks, it's kind of swinging back the other way, because the economics of printing a physical magazine just got too hard for a lot of places. But it's obviously easier in digital form, and it's not expensive to print it, and you can distribute way easier. So things are changing once again in the industry.
Right. That is an interesting leap we've made in technology in relation to that.
Yeah, it's always funny to me how much the technology drives how long books are, what's in fashion. It's all a careful dance.
Right.
I wonder, with the advent of sort of Twitter's short character count and TikTok, people talking about it potentially shortening people's attention spans and having negative impacts. I wonder if short story is going to come reign supreme soon over novel-length books. I personally don't think so. I think that, like, for me, for example, I'll always be reading novels, but maybe I'm becoming a dinosaur, and the newer generation might not.
I I tend not to buy the stories about changing humans as much. Humans have basically been the same since since recorded history. We don't change all that much, but the way things are presented to us and what it is and isn't kind of economically possible to do changes a lot. And also what's in fashion changes a lot.
One can argue that the short attention span thing in relation to internet and social media can actually have a positive effect on longer books, because when people go to books, they have a different mindset. I feel like people will actually want to submerge themselves in something longer and meaningful rather than just having the same thing they could get by hopping over to TikTok.
Yeah,
and in some genres, the Kindle and other ebook readers, I don't mean to be just Amazon centric, have really increased their readership. That people are glad to devour these books by the dozen.
Yeah, absolutely. And with also with short stories, I find, because I read, when I was judging this competition to get the submissions ready for Django, I read something like 250 short stories in 2 weeks, and I had to take lots and lots of breaks every few stories, because and what I think is it's there's a name for it, but when you switch your attention, it's fatiguing to your brain. And so I'd be switching from horror stories to fantasy stories to contemporary lit with new characters, new situations, and I would constantly have to adjust to that. And so I would get quite tired after reading a few of them. And I'd take a short break and I'd be okay. But with a novel, I could sit and read a novel. Like, I think I read Dune. But both me and my father told me this when he gave me Dune. He said, I read this in 24 hours when I couldn't put it down. And I said, oh, it can't be that interesting. And I read it in 24 hours and no fatigue. I mean, obviously I was tired, but not like decision and attention fatigue when you switch stories. So I think that the novel will always have a place. For sure.
Right. And novels and series have this rewarding sense to them, because you learn things and then they don't have to be explained to you again, and they're used in the story, and you feel like you're part of something. You understand something that someone who hasn't read it does not understand.
Yeah. And where you give us with your short story all these cool things, and then we don't get to know any more about them.
Well, I don't know either. I haven't.
No plans for a novel in this universe?
I'm thinking of writing other short stories in this universe.
It seems pretty cool. I'd certainly be excited to see more of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other than, we talked about your love of Neil Gaiman and Dune, what else do you think of as favorite media, either written or movies or anything?
My favorite book is The Secret History by Donna Tartt.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very different. It's like it's such a, I feel like it's a very unique field. It's very dark academia. And I think that what I would like to do is bring that sort of vibe to the fantasy genre, which other people are kind of doing, but I want to do it in my own unique way, obviously. Mm-hmm. And because most fantasy has a certain feel to it. It's a very fantasy feel. Or if you're going to YA, it's more of a Rick Riordan feel, right? And I sort of want to combine that with Donna Tartt's very, I don't know if there's any other word for it, dark academia type of feel. I haven't read Babel yet, but I understand that's
on my list as well. I was
right.
going to say
that's sort of what I'm getting at. Something like that, but obviously not that. But I'm going on a tangent. Other media that I like good stories. So, and I'm not like a big anime person, but I will watch anime if it's a good story. So I really like Death Note. I think it's a very compelling story.
That's one of my favorite stories. Partly because of the soundtrack made it just so epic, but the story itself was very intense. And like a story about two geniuses. This is always the question I had about Death Note, is if you have a story of two geniuses playing cat and mouse trying to catch each other as detectives, how do you write something like that? Like, do you have to be genius enough to understand the geniuses to write something that complex, right?
The secret to writing geniuses, and in shadow campaigns, there's a military genius, and People have asked me this question, and the secret is, as a writer, you have a lot more time. If it takes you 2 weeks to figure out a genius level thing that he figures out in 10 minutes, you get to cheat. Or like having written the story later, you can go back and make him look good earlier. You have all these advantages.
That makes a lot of sense. I always wondered how Yanis, did you say it Yanis?
Giannis, yeah.
Giannis, yeah. I said Janice for the first book or two, and then somebody explained the pronunciation in World, and I went, dang it. And I had to fix it for the next few chapters. I always wondered how he was just so good. And one of the things you do really well in those books is you get the military strategy of that time across, and you show it in the campaigns.
I would say the other trick is that you can just crib from real life. Right. Yeah. So a lot of the stuff that Giannis talks about, or the strategy stuff, is straight from Napoleon. And so, he was pretty good at it. So,
I got to read these books.
Copy for people.
Yeah, they're great.
Anyway, sorry, you were in the middle, Darcy.
What was I in the middle of? That is the question.
You were telling us.
What you were saying, Craig, about the two geniuses. That is one of my favorite tropes. Moriarty and Sherlock. That sort of the evil genius and the good genius. Kind of, although you can argue morally gray, pitted against each other, I find absolutely fascinating, and whenever it's done. The other one that has a similar feel is Hannibal, the show. You have it's not quite the same, but it has that general vibe to it of incredibly smart people playing games with each other, being friends, but being enemies at the same time. I think that's a really fascinating way to tell a story. So Death Note, I guess going back to the original question, what other media do I enjoy? So books, movies. I really loved Dune, the new movie.
Yeah, that was great.
I thought it was a fantastic adaptation. In terms of shows, I really enjoyed Midnight Mass. I don't know if you've seen it. I think that was a really interesting way to tell a vampire story. It was, and people complain it has a lot of monologuing, but I really like the monologues. So I thought
they were fine.
It's a thing that Flanagan does all the time. I feel like he really gives his actors a chance to sort of shine.
I feel like I'm reading a book in those parts. It's like, oh, this is fantastic writing. This is great. I love, and delivery is great. Everything.
I'm watching his new show now, The Midnight Club. It's fantastic.
Oh yeah, I'm in the middle there. I think on episode 8 or something, or maybe 6. Anyway, what other media do I enjoy? Sandman comic. That's the only comic I'm reading. In terms of what I read growing up, have either of you heard of George Alfred Henty?
I don't think so.
So he's familiar, but I'm not sure.
So he was born 1832, died 1902. He wrote historical fiction for teenage boys. So he covers basically everything from ancient Egypt up till the year he died. And from a modern perspective, obviously there are flaws in terms of it's very pro-colonial, pro-England, that type of thing.
Everything written in that time in England is
right. Exactly. So you have to be, I was just aware of that as you're reading it. And as I became a better writer, I realized he's not a very good writer, but he is a fantastic, storyteller. And his use of history is extraordinarily accurate. He was a very good historian, and the way he would weave a story with an interesting character through history, I found really fascinating. I learned a lot of history that way.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we're coming about to the end here. Did you have any questions or anything you want to talk about that we haven't covered?
Me? I don't know.
Or did you?
I did have another question. A couple questions actually. I was curious about. So you talked about leaving, being a magician and a chef because of your arthritis, and I made a joke about you choosing writing with a keyboard. But
right.
Has the arthritis affected your writing? Do you dictate, or do you use your hands, or is there any?
Funny enough, I think because I type so slowly, it doesn't hurt my hands at all to type.
That's great.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's the way I type, because I'm not like copying something down. I'm thinking about what I'm writing as I'm writing it. So it's for typing, it's fairly slow, let's say. And there are long pauses. So maybe that's why so far it hasn't been an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And I mean, that's great. I hope that keeps up for you because I'd love to continue reading what you write. I want you to have a long, healthy career as a writer here.
Thank
you. And another question I had is when you talked about your first draft of the story with the rabbit skull in the desert, obviously that's very different from what you ended up with and what we were here to talk about. So how many drafts and revisions did you go through from that initial concept to get to where you ended up?
Well, I don't know if I would call that a draft because I was still thinking about it. I spent like a couple of weeks just thinking about the story before I started writing it. And that story, while I was thinking about it, it just kept not going anywhere. It was just like, okay, he's going mad in the desert with his skull. Is he gonna like travel? I couldn't think of anything. I'm sure if I wanted to write the story, I could, but it wasn't interesting enough for me to try to figure it out. And then when I made that shift into a religious thinking, and there are some kind of parallels to that story of Jacob wrestling with an angel of God, and this idea of wrestling with the divine that you see repeatedly throughout mythos and human religion culture. That became suddenly very interesting to me, and I was able to sit down and actually write the story. And I think there were only the first draft, and then I just went back, added some more details, and sort of to flesh out those two characters. Oh, funny little side note about that. I sort of just made up the names. I just typed them. And then I was thinking about this interview last night. I decided to look up what they mean. And here, let me pull this up.
You always got to be careful. Random names always mean something in other languages.
Right. So Trump actually
impossible to avoid.
Yeah.
Trump fits surprisingly well. A weight, heaviness, burden. This is very heavy character. It's like, okay, that works. It's fine. And then Zhao, it just is kind of it's like light radiance. It's like, that doesn't really fit, but it's done.
Yeah. I really liked how you used a lot of repetition of similar phrases. Obviously, you had the summoning phrase, the Lord of Bone and God of Decay. Grant me my boon.
It's very common in religious things. This idea of repetitious phrases. The Rosary, for example, I'm sure it's common in other religions, and well, not just in Catholicism. All kinds of sects in Christianity have various variations of prayer beads and things. It has this. When you repeat something, dune, this repetition thing gives you this religious feel. So I wanted to include that in the story.
Yeah, and you did a good job with that too, because the characters all seem to have different approaches to it, right? Like Lack came and just said it outright and was like, I'm here to do this. Right. Trom come in and says like, grant me my boon, like give it. Has to roll his eyes and say the phrase really, mutters it really quickly. And then Zhao coming in and like posturing himself and kind of being more reverent, right? Which added details, and I thought that was pretty good. And I'm always a big fan of repetition, especially when you twist it a little bit each time. I think that always adds lots of impact to the story. The other thing I really liked was the pray and die. Like, what was that for? You quoted it a few minutes ago. Your very first line.
I stand before the altar of bones, and I do not pray. Pray and die, it is said.
I like that. I thought it was a great opening line. It captured my attention. I wanted to know why it said.
That was another thing I suppose I didn't mention. When I first came up with the phrase, I didn't realize that the character was seeking death. I was like, oh, how is he going to pray if you can't pray without dying? And then as I started writing it, I was like, wait, this is perfect. He wants to die. Okay, but he can't. Okay, let's have his god act like a very petty Greek god, as gods do.
Yeah, it was great.
And
I'm sorry?
Do you have a cat in your background?
Oh, that's a dog. We have 4 dogs. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, no, I've seen some animals walking around back there.
Yeah, they're around.
Yeah, and so obviously this Solid Flesh story is the story that won you the award, but it's not the first story that we've published of yours. We had another one that was published back in August called The Little Square Box, which was another one that I really enjoyed. It was that was a much more light and fun story, even though it still had a sort of a twisted, serious undertone.
Yes. Some people I've shown that story to are like, oh, this would be good for like a middle grade scholastic type of thing. It has that feel to it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody that enjoyed reading Darcy's Solid Flesh, I'd recommend you go back to our Fearless Friendship issue and check out The Little Square Box, because it's a lot of fun as well.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I want to be sensitive of Django's time here. So before he gets out of here, Darcy, do you have any questions that you might want to ask Django? I know you've cited a lot of quotes and talked about your favorite authors and never once mentioned him. So
that's totally fine. I don't.
So I don't know. I mean, you're going to go read his books now, I think, because
yes, for sure. This was how I discovered him. Like I said, I'm very new to fantasy. I'm still like I literally just started The Wizard of Earthsea today. I'm still getting through like the classical big name stuff. There is one thing in relation to the story that I didn't talk about that I kind of did want to talk about before we get to the very end, was the Knucklebones, which I found really mispronouncing. Fantastic. What's the word? Fascinating. And that came from Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere with the Marquis de Carabas. And there's one scene where it's just like, as an aside, he mentions it. And then I looked up the rules and I was like, what is this game? It's so interesting.
Real thing.
And then as soon as I saw that the prompt was Forgotten Lands in a Bone, I was like, oh, Knucklebones, maybe this will be a thing. Any questions for you? I don't know if I have any questions for you besides the ones that every author gets and every author, has an answer to. And also because I haven't read your work yet, I will. I don't know if I have. Oh, I don't know if that's a proper question. I'll try to formulate one anyway. Okay,
it's fine. If you don't have it, that's also fine.
Going back to historical fiction, Henty. When you are picking through history and trying to grab something to use in a fantasy setting, what is your criteria you look for? Is it just what's interesting, what works? Do you have a thought process behind that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I'm looking for sort of interesting stuff that will work in the story, and it's actually very freeing as a fantasy author, because my previous experience of reading history was more in school, and there's a lot of like, well, this is a good anecdote, but it probably never happened because things never really happen as amusingly as they get retold later. But like when you're writing a fantasy book, you can be like, I don't care if it's implausible, I'm still going to use it. Right? It doesn't matter that it wasn't real, or that the person didn't really say that at the time. You can use the best stuff. And so it becomes sort of a scavenger hunt of sort of picking through these things. Real history is so random, is sort of the wonderful thing about it. It makes no narrative sense, obviously, and there's just all these amazing things that happen. So it's that kind of thing that I'm looking for. But then also, I mean, I write a lot of military stuff and sort of historically based stuff, and I tend to look for sort of what are people's experiences, like what are these things actually like to live through, not necessarily what the strategy or the grand scale is like, but what it's like to be actually doing it in person. And that can be easy to find, or it can be hard to find. It's actually one of my first set of books, the Shadow Campaigns, are sort of based on the Napoleonic Wars, and that was great because that's kind of after the advent of mass literacy, and so everybody who was in the wars went home and wrote a memoir, and so there's a million memoirs and letters. Whereas if you want something sort of prior to 14 or 1500, it's much harder to get the average person's eye view. So I sort of cling to that when you can.
Yeah. Right. That makes a lot of sense. I had a question, was Django, what drew you to flintlock fantasy? Was that a genre? Or, I mean, I'm sure it was a genre before you got there. But was it, because I'd never heard of that before I told about your books.
I think they coined the term for us. Me and Brian McClellan, within about a month of each other, both came out with Napoleonic French Revolution books. completely independently. His is the Powder Mage series, which is very good. And with those two books coming out, they're like, oh, is this a new trend? And there's been plenty of others before that, and there will be plenty afterwards. So I think it was just sort of a momentary coincidence. But for me, it was actually, I had been reading Game of Thrones and that series, and I really liked what George had done with kind of a fantasy series, sort of closer to its historical roots. Like, it's still pretty fantastic, but it's tighter than some. And I was like, I kind of want to do that, to do a fantasy that's closer to actual history, but I don't want to do kind of 12th to 14th century England and Scotland, which is the sort of standard fantasy setting of knights and castles, because George had already done it and he did it really well. And then sometime later, I was reading a book, David Chandler's Campaigns of Napoleon, and I was like, this would be great. Like, I should do this. And that's basically where it started.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I came to your series. I read The Black Company, the whole series.
That's wonderful.
I was just so good. And I was like, what do I do now? I need more of this sort of military stuff. And I tried the First Law and found it wasn't quite for me, at least not at that time. And so I jumped and I was recommended your books, the Shadow Campaigns, after this, and exactly what I was looking for. Love them. So thanks for writing them. Glad you came through that process and put those books out. It's great. Okay. So I know we're coming up to the end here. Do either of you have anything else that you want to add right now?
I'm good.
I don't think so.
All good. Well, thank you, Django, for agreeing to be the judge of our contest. It was an absolute honor. Love to have you. It's a pleasure.
Glad to do it. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for reading my story, and again for your comments.
Very much. I very much enjoyed it.
Yeah, and Darcy, thank you for taking the chance to submit to Elegant Literature, both your first time and this time, because I know you said it was kind of the first time you were doing this. So I'm really pleased that you did, and I'm really glad that you are here. And congratulations once again on winning the award.
Of course, and thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome, guys. Well, have a wonderful day. I'm sure we'll all be in touch going forward.
Yeah, you'll do some kind of tagging so I can.
Oh yeah.
When you post this, okay.
Yeah.
I will see it. All right. It's great to meet you, Darcy. Nice to see you.
Pleasure,
Craig. Good luck with your writing. I hope you finish those novels at some point. And
thank you. I hope you get to see them too.
All right. Thanks a lot, you guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye now.